Hey there, happy friends, Even Star, and you're in the shed at Hancock's House of Happy, and today I have for you a complete beginner's guide to working with linen and cross stitch. So this is a perfect video for someone who's maybe you've been cross stitching for a while, you've been using regular old sort of Aida, but you want to maybe up your game a little bit, or you've come across a really classic design that needs to be stitched on linen and you've never worked with it before. Well, this is a video for you, because we're going to cover absolutely everything. It's a long video, so I do hope you bear with me, because we're going to cover why you would want to choose linen. What is it? Like, what is it as a material? How is it different from other more common cross-stitching materials? How do you figure out what count you need? How do you choose linen if you're a beginner? What kind of equipment a beginner cross-stitching with linen might want? Handling and working with it, and then finally at the end we'll have a little bit of a tutorial on actually stitching on linen. So what prompted this video is I have a beautiful new design released on the website. This is a free download for the next couple of weeks. Well, it's free forever, but the designs are coming out over the next couple of weeks. A mid-century modern sampler, and I think this would be an absolutely beautiful design to stitch on linen, and it's also a very beginner friendly design. So if you've never worked with linen before and you're curious about using that material and what the results will be, this is a really good place to get started. So without further ado, let's get this show on the road. So, perhaps the first item that we need to address is why choose linen? What is it good for, right? So, most cross-stitching, I think, these days, and what most people gravitate towards too, is this for working with. And this is what is called, and we'll have a bit of close-up of this in a bit, this is called Aida, and it's an open weave fabric. It's made from cotton. It's very easy to work with because it's got this nice blocky texture that you know where the needle is going. It's very difficult to lose counts on it or miss a row. This is what most people use. Even advanced cross stitchers, you know, use that. So why would you want to choose linen, which is a far more difficult fabric to work with? It's also more expensive to work with. Well, there's a few reasons, and one reason, which I think is probably the most important reason, is that it's appropriate to the design. Now, if you're stitching, you know, my kawaii sushi cats or a video game character, Aida's fine, right? It's a modern design, modern fabric is great. Now, if you're doing a more classic design, so maybe you're doing a wedding sampler with very traditional motifs, maybe you want to try your hand at my mid-century modern sampler as well. Those more traditional designs are far better suited to a more traditional material such as linen, because it's closer to what those kinds of motifs were stitched on when they originated, right? So I think what you need to think about is, if you're moving into linen, if you're choosing linen, is it appropriate to the design? Sometimes it's not. Like, say, sometimes Aida is more appropriate to the design, you know, especially if it's a more modern type of design. So think about what you're stitching. Maybe linen is better for that pattern. And the second reason is it's a challenge to work with. Now, I'm someone who likes to challenge herself and push herself a little bit, and I started stitching on linen, I think it was 2008. Now, I'd been cross-stitching for 5 or 6 years by then, and I think at that point I was sort of in place with that hobby where it's like I wanted to do something a little bit more challenging, something that would allow me to create more classic designs. So, you know, those traditional classic designs. And I got myself a wedding sampler because my cousin got married that year. I think it was 2008. And I wanted to stitch her and her bow a very traditional sampler because they live in this really cute 1950s house. So I wanted something that was going to go with their decor. And I thought, well, it's a bit of a challenge. So those are a couple of reasons why I kind of moved into stitching on linen. And I think once you get past, you know, the initial challenges, and we'll cover in this video a few things that can make that experience a lot easier and a lot more enjoyable, because I don't want somebody picking it up and rage quitting. There are ways to go about starting cross-stitching on linen that mean you're going to be able to use this wonderful material in your repertoire to create some beautiful designs. So what is linen? Linen is a woven fabric, and I've got 3 examples with me here today. It's a woven fabric, and it's a plant-based fabric. It's made from flax, and flax is a reedy, grassy type plant. It's where flax seeds come from, obviously, and it has these very long, fibrous stems, and they extract the fiber from the stems, they spin it into thread, much like cotton or wool is spun into thread, and then they weave it into fabric like this. And as you can see, it comes in many different colors and varieties, just as many as you would get with your more traditional, or actually not traditional. Linen is the traditional fabric. The more modern cross-stitching fabric, like this cotton Aida. I'd like to talk a little bit now about how linen differs from the more modern and probably more these days widely used Aida fabric for cross-stitch. Aida, very beginner friendly for cross-stitch. Linen, not so much. If you're just starting out with cross-stitching, do not go for linen. Please don't. You will just rage quit. So what's the difference between this fabric, linen, and Aida fabric? Well, the first is material. Aida is, I think, almost exclusively a cotton fabric. I've not seen it made out of any other kinds of materials, although these days people get pretty fancy. It'd be interesting to see some of this, you know, made from bamboo or hemp, you know, things like that, because generally linen, as we learned just now, is made out of flax, but you can get linen, can be a general term for fabric of a similar weave and texture made out of other fibers like hemp or bamboo, or you can get linen made out of cottons. I mean, obviously linen is a generic term for bedding, which is not made out of flax at all. It is made out of cotton. So that's one of the major differences, is the materials that they're actually made out of. The second difference, major difference, is how they're woven. So linen, as you can see, let's have a different example here, is an even weave fabric, which means it's one thread goes over and under and over and under the other thread. So you've got, you know, a warp and a weft sort of traditional woven fabric, and it's also quite open. So you know, you look at maybe like a cotton pillowcase, you're not going to be able to see the weave in a cotton pillowcase like that. So it's a fairly open weave, linen. In contrast, you've got this Aida fabric, and this is a 14 count Aida. It's not a single thread going over and under another single thread. What they do is they have a bunch of threads, a bundle of threads going over and under another bundle of threads. And what happens is you get this very blocky, sort of knobbly texture with these very pronounced holes, and this is why Aida is so good for beginners for cross stitching, because you can see exactly where your needle's going. It's very difficult to you know, stitch too long or too short on this, because it's like one hole, one stitch. The other difference is how they're counted. So Aida comes in things like 14 count, 16 counts. I don't think I've really ever seen anything over 16 count. You can get it in less than that, like a 10, so it's like very open. You won't use big threads with it for tapestry. And what that means is there's 14 stitches per inch, which means there's 14 of these holes in this blocky texture per inch, or 14 blocks per inch. So very easy to count. Linen, on the other hand, is measured in thread count. So for example, I think this is what is called a 28 count linen, which simply means that if you counted the threads from top to bottom for an inch, you'd end up with 28 threads. Which again is similar to, you know, if you're buying bed linen made out of cotton, you have a thread count, and that's just simply the number of threads per inch. Now bear in mind that, and we'll get to this in a little bit, is that if you have a 28 count linen, that doesn't mean it's 28 stitches per inch. Now, if you're really advanced, you can, right? You can like stitch over one thread. I've done that on occasion to do like really micro things, but please do not do that. If you're a beginner, you will rage quit. You stitch over 2 threads over and 2 threads up. So if there's 28 threads and you're stitching over 2 at a time, you still end up with 14 stitches per inch. So if you're wondering if you've got a design that gives you measurements for 14 count Aida, and you're just going like, well, what the heck do I do for linen then? Because a 14 count linen would look weird, right? It would just be like, there would be almost nothing there. What you do is you just double the count of what they've given you for the Aida, and you'll have the correct thread count for the linen that you require. Okay, so enough with the close-ups already. The reason being is that my camera just won't focus, and what we're going to talk about now is choosing linen for beginner cross-stitching. It's very, very important to get a close-up of some of these examples when talking about this. So now, if you're doing your first ever project in linen, be kind to yourself. Do not choose a design or a fabric that is so challenging that you're just going to quit. And believe me, it is possible to do that to yourself. So if you're going to be stitching on linen for the first time, then yes, I would suggest that my mid-century modern sampler design is perfect for beginners, because it's not too difficult. You've got lots of nice big blocks of color there. It's not too fiddly. So that's a very actually good design to get started with linen. Oops, sorry, that was my phone there. The second is to be very careful choosing the fabric. Now, there's many different brands, and unlike Aida, which is it's going to be the same the world over. It's like going to McDonald's or the Premier Inn, right? If you're going to buy Aida, you know what you're getting. Linen, you don't necessarily know what you're getting, because there's so many different manufacturers and different types. So, again, looking at the 3 types here, we go from this white sort of very uniform to this little bit more uneven. This is extremely smooth, very slippery. And then you've got this extremely rustic. This was almost like stitching on microscopic burlap. This was a horrible, horrible fabric to stitch on. So if being a beginner, go for 28 count, right? Nice big stitches on that one. Do not do 36, right? That's crazy. And if you can, and I know that ordering off the internet is what the kids do these days, try and not do that, but go down to the craft store or to your stitching store or your preferred supplier and handle some of the fabric, or at least look at it in a package, right? So that you know what you're going to be getting, because there's a big difference between this starting out and this starting out. Huge, right? So if I was going to look at these three and think about what is the most beginner friendly, this one is definitely the most beginner friendly. So as you can see, the threads are all the same size, all the same thicknesses. The weave is extremely even, very, very uniform, very easy to see. The holes in between the threads, perfect. This is a perfect, and I think this is what I actually did my first linen project on, a piece of this. Very easy to work with. It's actually quite thick, easy to handle, it's soft, it's not slippery, it's got quite a bit of body to it, nice and heavy, right? That's a really good fabric, linen fabric for a beginner. Next up, for if you're getting a little bit more advanced, is a linen like this. Now, as you can see here, threads, they're a little bit less uniform. You've got, so you see there, and like right there, there's sort of a little bit of a puffy. This is sort of a more rustic linen. This is the kind of thing you'd stitch a sort of vintage sampler on, because it kind of gives that sort of handmade quality with these sort of little unpuffy bits. But you know, threads, they're thick, they're thin, they're not so evenly woven. It's a little bit more difficult to count your way across to and up to with that one confidently and quickly. So if you're moving up on linen, that's perfect. Last one example I've got, which I think this was like a 32. It could be a 36, but what it definitely is freaking insane, right? My snail there out of the way. So as you can see, you can barely see, like this is like extremely close up, you can barely see where the threads begin and end. They're all different thicknesses. There's some that are like a micron and others that are like a millimeter. Very difficult. So for your first linen project, do not pick this. In fact, I bought this as part of, I was going to do a wedding anniversary sampler, a huge vintage wedding anniversary sampler, and I just quit after, I think I did, well, maybe 6 inches by 8 inches of the design, and I just gave up. I mean, and this is someone who has been cross-stitching for years and is used to working with linen. So as a beginner, choose wisely, choose something beginner-friendly, very even weave, even threads, that's easy to see. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about equipment. Now, if you're already a cross-stitcher, and I would suggest that you should already be a cross-stitcher, do not start out cross-stitching on linen. Start out cross-stitching on this stuff. Start cross-stitching on Aida. And I'm telling you right now, right, this is what most people cross-stitch on. You can have beautiful results with this. No shame, right? But if you want to up your game a little bit, or maybe you've got a more classic design, like the mid-century modern sampler that linen is more suited for, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There are a few things that you might want to add to your cross-stitching arsenal, which will make working on linen extremely enjoyable, and just make your life easier. And the first thing is, and when I got this, it changed my life, and I use it for stitching on everything now, because I'm getting old and, you know, my eyes don't see as well, and I refuse to wear glasses, is one of these. It is a clip-on magnifying glass, right? So clip-on magnifying glass, a little bit scary. And this, all I do is I clip this on the frame. As you can see, it's bendy. You can clip it anywhere, clip it on whatever you're working on. You put your work under that. When you're working on linen, where the holes are like very very tiny, this just makes it so much easier to see where your needle has to go. Now, you can totally stitch on linen, especially if it's like, you know, a lower count like 28 without it. But you might find that it can be a bit slow and laborious, and you can find yourself taking a few stitches out here and there because you've missed a thread, right? So I don't know if this will work, but as you can see, that just makes it so much better. And that, oof, God, I just need the close-up of my face today, man. These aren't expensive. I think I paid maybe £25 for this. I've had it for like a million years, right? So they don't wear out. You'll probably get one cheaper than that, you know, maybe on Amazon or your local craft store. Shop local, guys. Don't give Bezos any money. He's kind of a jerk, right? So this makes it so much more enjoyable. It takes it from being like hard work to being something you can just sit down and enjoy. The second thing, which I use for just cross-stitching and a lot of craft work in general, is one of these clip-on light bulb thingy jigs with a daylight light bulb in it. So where I stitch, I've got a shelf above me. Just clip that on, shines right down. You can just bright light. You can see what you're doing any time of day. These are really great for actually any kind of crafting, and these are really cheap. I think I got this like for £4. So if you translate that into dollars, it's going to be like $4, or if you've got a Walmart, probably cheaper than that, right? So brilliant. It will just make it such an enjoyable experience. Now, the other thing to bear in mind when you're working with linen is your needles. Now, when I cross stitch, you're not going to be able to see this, unfortunately. So yeah, I'm not going to get a close-up of that, really. This is what I used for cross-stitching. So it's fairly short, blunt. It's got a long, wide eye on it. For stitching on Aida, this is perfect, right? You don't need a sharp needle for stitching on Aida because you're not trying to get through fabric because the hole's already there, right? And it's got a nice wide eye on it as well, which is really easy for threading. Stitching on linen is a little bit different. Because the threads are so close together, much closer together, you don't really have that defined hole. You need a needle that's a little bit thinner and sharp for getting through there. It doesn't need to be super sharp, but you don't want sort of a blunt-ended tapestry needle, right, which you can use for cross stitch, and a very small eye, which makes it a pain for threading, especially if you're doing like 2-count threads. But it makes it so much easier getting the thread through those tiny holes in the fabric. And it's also short. I prefer very short needles for cross stitching in general because you don't need. You're not doing sort of long running stitches or anything like that. You don't need it. Basically, it's just something to get the thread through the hole, right? So, short needles, perfect for cross stitching. So those are my probably top 3 essentials for working with linens that, you know, you can do it without them, but it will make the experience so much more enjoyable. Just a few words about handling linen fabric. So when you buy linen, unless you bought it as part of a kit where it comes pre-measured, it just comes as yardage, right? It comes like this. This is several yards of linen that I've got rather messily in the corner there for a project. So it comes like that. If you're buying it a particular or measuring out for a particular design, look at how many stitches is the design, and double it, and you'll know what count of linen that's going to be, right? If the pattern comes and says it's 12 inches on Aida 14 count, you need 12 inches of 28 count. So that's how you measure it. And always leave yourself a nice, I usually leave about 3 inches around a design for framing. Now, because linen is quite it can be quite variable. So if you're looking at this, which we've looked at before, this is sort of our beginner-friendly linen. If this says it's 28 count, it's going to be 28 count, right? Because it's so even. This and this, on the other hand, where the threads are quite uneven, the weave is quite uneven, it might be a good idea to do yourself a test swatch. So get a little scrap like that, do your 14 stitches or your 16 or whatever it is, and measure it. And what you might find is that your 14 stitches don't quite make an inch, or maybe you need a half a stitch to make that inch. But generally speaking, even if it's uneven like that, it works out in the end to be, you know, give or take. So you're not going to be like inches out. So those are my tips for handling or, you know, buying and measuring linen. Now, when I stitch on linen or any other fabric, I don't use hoops or frames or anything else. Unfortunately, I don't have an example here, but what I do is I have a dowel, right? Wooden rod. I roll the unused or the completed design up on the dowel. I have a wooden stand that's got like felt clips, clip it there, and I stitch by hand on that, just holding it with my hand. I would recommend against using a hoop or a frame on linen, because once you get a crease in it, it's very difficult to get out. And I am not one for washing and ironing my hard work, especially knowing what, you know, washing machines and irons can do to things. Even if you do it on the back, you know, iron on the back, I'm not a big fan of doing that. And even with a really hot steam iron, you may not get those creases out. So if you are going to work on a hoop with linen or a frame or anything like that, do your stitching, take it out. Don't leave it in there for days at a time, because you'll get a crease in there that you just cannot get out. And that brings me to my last tip for working with linen is do not pre-wash. I never pre-wash any of my fabric. That's probably cross-stitching heresy. But I just find that it just ruins it. When you get linen like this especially, it's nice, it's stiff, there's no fuzziness on it, it's you know, it's really smooth, you know, 'cause it's got a little bit of sizing in it, really easy to work with. The minute you stick that in the washing machine, it just gets ruined. And it's not like when you're cross-stitching, you need to be worried about shrinkage or anything, because it's never going in the wash. Again, I see on like cross-stitching forums all the time, it's like, how do you wash your designs? It's like, never. Like, what are you doing? It's like you've just spent days or months working on that. Why would you put it in like a machine that like spins? Oh no, just no. Why would you do that? Or in a sink? Why would you do that? No. So, no pre-washing. Okay, so now it comes to the part that you're all waiting for, and it's probably going to be almost impossible for me to show you properly, and that is how you stitch on linen. So I've got myself just a little piece of scrap here. I've threaded my needle, my short, sharp needle there with a small eye. I've got 2 threads. So some people, when they stitch on linen, they'll only use 1 thread. I use the standard 2. That's when I learned cross stitching. It was like 2 threads forever. Fight me. I know some people tend to use on a bigger count. They'll use more on a smaller count, and they use less. Now, I would say that if you're working on, like, again, don't do this to yourself. With 36 linen, then yeah, maybe 1 thread, but we're dealing with like 28 count here, so 2 threads is sufficient. So I've just come up through in between 2 threads in the weave there, as you can see. And when you stitch on linen, you stitch across 2 threads. So that's across 2 and up 2, and this is where it's going to be very difficult. So there's several ways, well, not several ways, there's a couple of ways that you can do this. Now, if you're a beginner, what I would suggest the best way of counting your stitches is you come up through your hole and you count across 2, so you go 1,
one hole, so across one thread, across two threads, you go down in the hole, well, you don't go down, so two threads, and then you count up from, there's one thread. Trying to do this on camera here, so it's one thread, two threads, right? So right there. Take your needle down, right? So there you go. You've got half a stitch. Now people cross stitch all different ways. Now you can do all your stitches at the same angle going across. I'm a very disorganized stitcher. I like to do finished stitches. So I'm gonna look at where I began, right? So there I began. You count across one thread, count across two threads, bring your needle up, and then from there it's really easy to see where your needle needs to go because you've already got that sort of matrix defined there. So you go 1, 2, and then 1, 2 across. Now I know this is probably not very clear on this film and the lighting is terrible in here, but there's your first stitch, right? So next stitch, you come up where your previous stitch was to start your next one. There you go, right? And you count across two threads, so that's one thread, two threads. And if you look at it close up, which is very difficult here, you know you've done it properly because there should be a hole between where your thread comes up and your thread goes down, right? So there's a hole there, and then your thread goes down, right? So it's 2 across and 2 up, and you just come out where your other stitch ended. The other way, rather than counting across 2 and up 2, which is sort of what I've got in the habit of doing, it might be a little bit more advanced, is that you count diagonally. So you bring your thread up, and rather than counting 1, 2 across, what you do is you count the holes diagonally. So I've come up through a hole, diagonally, I skip a hole, and then on the diagonal, the next hole is where I put my thread down. Come up, and you already know that you're in the right place. You just bring it down to be in line with those 2 other stitches. So there's the other way of counting. Things to be aware of and common errors in working with linen, and this is sort of the intermediary. Linen is missing a thread. So what happens is, for example, you'll bring up your needle, and so maybe you'll count down 2, but you'll only count across 1, and you'll end up with like a weird narrow looking stitch like that, right? Because you've only counted across 1 there. So again, I apologize for the lighting and the close-up in here, but that's really the best I can do with the equipment I have. So that is how you stitch on linen. So you can do the up, across 1 thread, across 1 thread, up 1 thread, up 1 thread, and down. Or you can do the diagonal method, which is you come up, go diagonally, there's a hole there, skip it, go diagonally, there's a hole there, needle down.
And there you have it. That was the complete beginner's guide to working with linen. Now, if you enjoyed that, please give this video a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more videos like that, please leave me comments below, and also subscribe to this channel. Now, I mentioned several times this lovely mid-century modern design. This is a free download over the next several days on the website. So every single panel, you can come back every day and get a new panel, which is really what prompted this video in the first place, because I think this would be so beautiful stitched on linen. You can go to the website, and I will leave links to that below. And you can also help support me by, you know, sharing this video. That's a free way to support me. Now, you can also, if you, rather than like downloading a panel per day for this sampler, if you want this as a printable PDF, you can support me on Patreon for just $2 a month. And not only will you be getting this beautiful exclusive design, I have at least 3 exclusive designs for Patreons per month coming up. I've got like 6 months of content planned already. So as well as free, or as well as cross-stitch designs exclusive to Patreons, there'll also be like really cute printables and stuff like this. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you stuck it out to the end. This was a very long tutorial. But I think linen is a fantastic and challenging fabric for a cross-stitcher who wants to up their game or produce a classic design on a classic material. And as long as you are mindful of a few things, have the right equipment, and choose the right material to work with, your beginnings in linen will be a pleasurable and rewarding experience. So until next time, you're in the shed here with Even Star at Hancock's House of Happy. Bye!